When you hear the phrase energy attacks, you probably imagine something out of a Marvel movie or Dragon Ball Z. But what if I told you this is a very real thing that could be happening on US soil as we speak? It all started in late 2016 at the US Embassy in Havana, Cuba. Dozens of workers reported a sudden onset of mild to severe symptoms that included migraine-like headaches, ringing of the ears, vertigo, nausea, and dizziness, among other things. These symptoms were noticeably preceded by what the victims described as a wave of pressure through their heads, accompanied by a loud chirping sound that they compared to a cicada swarm. Several officials were forced into early retirement due to these symptoms never going away, and in some cases they were so bad that they caused permanent brain damage. Theories as to what was causing this phenomenon ranged wildly, from chemicals used to treat pests in the embassy to even the chirping of the Caribbean cricket. Another theory suggested these attacks were being caused by sonic weaponry, a weapon that uses a concentrated sound blast to cause injury and disorientate the intended victim. As science fiction as it may sound, these actually already exist and are commonly implemented by riot police for breaking up large crowds. By mid-2017, the reports of this mysterious illness, now dubbed Havana Syndrome, had become so numerous the embassy expelled 2 Cuban diplomats and removed all non-essential personnel. Initially, the US government wasn't officially blaming Cuba for the incident, and cited the removal of the 2 diplomats as a precautionary measure. But later that year, President Donald Trump came out and said that he personally believed the Cuban government was responsible. Then White House Chief of Staff John Kelly echoed this sentiment to a degree, but stopped short of outright saying Cuba was perpetrating the attacks, simply stating that, in his opinion, the Cuban government could put a stop to them if they wanted to. This strained the already fragile relationship between the 2 countries, which had only begun mending in the early 2010s. Representatives for the Cuban government accused the US of misleading the public about the nature of the attacks, and insisted they were cooperating to the best of their ability to help resolve the situation. In early 2018, the Associated Press reported that an investigation by the FBI, which had not been made available to the public, found no evidence suggesting sonic weaponry was responsible. But an expose on the incident printed later that year in The New Yorker alleged that the FBI's investigation had been stymied by the CIA, who were hesitant to reveal the identities of the victims due to concerns about potential leaks. Then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson convened an investigation by a hand-picked accountability board within the State Department. But as we'll see, this group would end up drawing some criticism. Also that year, the Canadian government announced that they too had received reports from their embassy in Cuba of similar incidents, which had injured several of their employees and resulted in them removing all non-essential personnel as well. At the request of the US government, researchers from the University of Pennsylvania conducted a study on the incident and examined the workers who'd been affected over the course of several months. Their findings were published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, in March of 2018, with a follow-up report published in July of 2019. The researchers concluded that the embassy workers were suffering from what was described as a, quote, persistent concussion syndrome, where the victim would feel concussion-like symptoms for months, and in some cases years after the initial incident. The researchers could not conclude what had caused these, though the report did state that exposure to pulsed radio frequencies and microwave energy could be a likely culprit. It is worth noting, however, there were many in the scientific community who criticized these findings. In June of 2018, It was reported that several employees at the US consulate in Guangzhou, China were experiencing symptoms very similar to Havana Syndrome. This was the first report of such an incident taking place outside of Cuba, at least as far as the public knew. In fact, the prior year had seen several CIA agents working in and around Moscow come forward saying they were experiencing these sort of symptoms as well. And here's where things get a little political, so I'm going to do my best to explain this as neutrally as possible, even though I will almost definitely end up making someone mad. So there were a lot of roadblocks during these investigations, due to leadership within the State Department and the CIA not being on the same page as the agents investigating the attacks. And most of this conflict seems to center around Russia. Several current and former members of the CIA and State Department were of the belief that Russia was responsible for these attacks, a theory the leadership within the Trump administration did not support, who instead were much more interested in holding Cuba responsible. Regardless of who you believe here, what's undeniable is this caused a rift between the people on the ground investigating these attacks and their leadership, resulting in the US government not really making any progress despite multiple investigations taking place over multiple different agencies. Things got even worse when in 2020, a special counsel investigation into the State Department determined there was a, quote, high likelihood of wrongdoing by the department's leadership at the time. Over a dozen agents who worked in and around Moscow had been affected by these attacks, and ended up filing a lawsuit against the US government alleging the State Department had not only been negligent in its duty to protect their employees, but had outright tried to cover up what happened to them. As if all this wasn't enough of a mess, in 2019, a White House official reported experiencing Havana Syndrome-like symptoms while walking her dog in the suburbs of Northern Virginia, just minutes away from the US Capitol. And the following year, in November of 2020, another incident was reported to have taken place on the Ellipse, a lawn that is directly adjacent to the southern yard of the White House. By this point, the total number of government officials affected by these attacks was over 40, and a report by the National Academy of Sciences released around the same time seemed to be in agreement with the JAMA findings that microwave radiation was the likely culprit. By December of 2020, the Department of Defense, particularly Acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller, had grown frustrated with what they saw as a lackluster response to the attacks by the CIA and State Department, and established their own task force to look into these attacks. Now, it's important to note that this is highly unusual, as investigating these sorts of events typically falls under the jurisdiction of the State Department or the CIA. By establishing a task force of their own, the Department of Defense was basically saying, you guys are doing a terrible job, so now we're going to look into it. And Christopher Miller even stated in an interview from March of this year that his goal with establishing this task force was to shame the CIA and State Department because he didn't feel they were taking the problem seriously. In April, the Senate Intelligence Committee, headed by Democrat Mark Warner and Republican Marco Rubio, began an investigation into these attacks. And while I know you're probably rolling your eyes at what feels like the 20th investigation being opened on this, a Senate Intelligence Committee pulls quite a bit of weight. And if they're looking into it, then it's pretty safe to say this is now a high priority for the US government. If you're interested in true crime, criminal justice history, or mysterious stories from around the world, consider hitting that subscribe button below so you can be updated whenever we post something new. Also, let us know what you think about this story in the comments. What are some of your guys' theories as to what's causing this and who's behind it? I'm curious what you think. I know this was a bit of a departure from what we normally cover, but I found this story just too fascinating not to do a video on it, so hopefully you guys enjoyed it. This is Crime Spot, and thank you for watching.